They called him a poet, a teacher, a voice from the distant past, a name that rests between history and legend. Tonight, we explore the life of Homer. You're listening to Boring Biography, a sleep story created for calm listening and quiet reflection. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let your thoughts grow still. He left no confirmed birthplace, no portrait, and no certain biography. Yet his stories traveled across centuries, carried by memory and voice before they were ever written down. His world was one of long sea journeys, distant islands, and songs shared beside firelight. Imagine waves moving across a dark sea, stars above silent ships, a storyteller speaking into the night. Let the story begin. Homer was an ancient Greek poet, traditionally associated with two of the most important epic poems ever composed, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He is generally placed in the early period of Greek history, many centuries before the classical philosophers and playwrights. Exact details about his life are not known, and scholars have long debated when he lived and whether a single individual composed both works. Even with these uncertainties, his name has remained closely linked with the beginnings of Western literary tradition. The true identity of Homer remains uncertain, and modern scholars generally do not accept the traditional idea that a single, clearly documented author stood behind both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Instead, they view Homer as a name attached to a long oral storytelling tradition that developed over generations. In ancient times, however, people preferred a single great author figure, and over the centuries, many stories about his life were created and repeated. Because no reliable contemporary record of his life exists, later biographies gradually took on a legendary tone. Ancient writers placed him sometime after the Trojan War and described him in symbolic ways rather than historical ones. Today, researchers examine his supposed life together with what is called the Homeric question, an ongoing academic discussion about who composed the epics, how they were formed, and how they were passed down before being written. Some of the earliest indirect mentions of Homer appear in early Greek poetry, where later poets refer to lines and themes associated with the epics. From there, traditions expanded. Many ancient biographies describe Homer as blind, a detail that became widely accepted in art and storytelling. Other accounts gave him divine or heroic ancestry, linking him to legendary singers, mythic families, or even the Muses themselves. These claims reflected admiration more than evidence. Different regions of the Greek world claimed him as their own. Various traditions named places such as Chios, Smyrna, Syme, Argos, Pylos, or Athens as his birthplace. Some stories described him as a wandering bard who traveled from town to town reciting poetry at festivals. Others said he trained with earlier singers, performed sacred songs, or composed additional lost works. There were even tales explaining his death in poetic or symbolic ways. No single version became universally accepted. What remains, in the calm view of modern study, is not a confirmed biography, but a collection of traditions. The poems endure with clarity and structure, while the poet behind the name stays distant and indistinct, preserved more as a cultural figure than a documented individual. Today, the name Homer is linked only with two epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These works are the only texts widely accepted by modern scholars as belonging to the Homeric tradition in a meaningful sense. They stand apart in scale, structure, and influence, and they are the foundation of Homer's lasting reputation. In the ancient world, however, many more writings were sometimes credited to Homer. These included the Homeric hymns, short religious poems addressed to various gods, as well as narrative works such as the Contest of Homer and Hesiod, several epigrams, and a number of lost or fragmentary epics connected to the Trojan War cycle. Other titles later linked to his name included the Little Iliad, the Nostoi, the Thebaid, the Cypria, the Epigoni, and smaller poetic works with comic or experimental tone, such as the Frog-Mouse War and the Margites. Modern scholarship does not accept these additional attributions as authentic. Even in antiquity, agreement about their authorship was inconsistent. Different regions and writers assigned famous, anonymous poems to Homer as a way of honoring them or increasing their authority. Attaching his name gave a work cultural weight and familiarity. The wide range of texts once credited to him shows less about a single author and more about his position in Greek culture. Homer became a central symbolic figure, a traditional source of poetic authority. Over time, many stories and poems gathered around his name, while only the Iliad and the Odyssey remained firmly and consistently connected to it. The study of Homer is one of the oldest continuous traditions in literary scholarship. It began in the ancient world and continued through Greek, Roman, and later Byzantine periods. Over time, the purpose of this study changed, but the steady attention given to the poems never fully disappeared. Generations of readers returned to the same verses, copying them, explaining them, and teaching them to students in structured settings. Some of the earliest recorded criticism focused on how the poems described the gods. Certain early thinkers objected to these portrayals, arguing that divine figures should not behave in flawed or human ways. Other interpreters responded calmly by suggesting that the stories should be read symbolically rather than literally. According to this view, the gods and events represented natural forces or moral ideas expressed through narrative. In Greek and later Hellenistic schools, the Iliad and the Odyssey became core teaching texts. Students learned language, memory, and rhetoric by reading and reciting passages. Teachers worked through the lines slowly, explaining rare words, unfamiliar customs, and poetic expressions. The Iliad, especially its opening books, received the most detailed classroom attention for many centuries, partly because of its formal structure and heroic themes. Because the poems were studied so closely, a long tradition of written commentary developed. Scholars produced line-by-line explanations to clarify grammar, history, geography, and mythological references. These notes were added in margins and compiled into larger guides. Some philosophical schools read deeper meanings into the verses and treated the poems as containers of hidden wisdom. They interpreted scenes and characters as lessons about ethics, nature, and the order of the world. As Homer's authority grew, he was sometimes described not only as a poet, but as a teacher of universal knowledge. His reputation expanded beyond literature into moral and philosophical territory. Later Byzantine scholars continued this careful work of explanation and preservation. They assembled very large commentaries, gathering earlier notes and adding their own observations. Some of these works extend across thousands of pages in modern printed form. Across the centuries, the pattern remained steady and unhurried. The poems were read, copied, explained, and taught again, each generation adding another layer of quiet study to the long history of Homeric scholarship. In the late 15th century, interest in ancient Greek texts grew steadily across Europe. Scholars searched libraries and monasteries for manuscripts and worked to prepare reliable printed editions. In Florence, a Greek scholar named Demetrios Chalkokondyles produced one of the first printed editions of the Homeric poems. This publication made the Iliad and the Odyssey more widely available to Renaissance readers and marked a turning point in how the texts were studied and circulated. Printing houses, reading rooms, and universities began to handle Homer not only as inherited tradition, but as a text to be examined and compared. Renaissance scholars often returned to older interpretive habits. Allegorical reading became popular again. Many humanists described Homer as a deeply wise poet whose verses concealed philosophical truth beneath story and symbol. At the same time, in Western Europe, the Latin poet Virgil was more commonly read in schools, and Homer was frequently interpreted through comparison with him. Readers approached the Greek epics with expectations shaped by Roman literary standards. Not all later scholars were approving. In the 17th century, the French critic François Hedelin argued strongly against the traditional admiration of Homer. He described the poems as disordered and inconsistent, and suggested they were assembled from unrelated songs rather than composed as unified works. His view was severe and controversial, but it opened the door to more skeptical analysis. A generation later, the English scholar Richard Bentley proposed a moderated position. He believed a historical Homer likely existed, but as an early oral poet whose songs were later gathered and shaped into the epics known today. He imagined festival performances, traveling singers, and gradual compilation across centuries rather than a single act of composition. In the 18th century, the Italian thinker Giambattista Vico went further. He suggested that Homer was not one person at all, but a collective name representing many early Greek singers. In his view, the poems expressed the shared voice of a culture rather than an individual author. Homer became, in this interpretation, a symbolic figure. A major shift came with the work of Friedrich August Wolff, whose detailed study argued that the epics began as shorter oral songs, composed centuries before they were written down. He proposed that these songs circulated through memory and performance before later editors assembled them into longer poetic structures. His work strongly influenced 19th century scholarship and gave rise to what became known as the Annalist school. Annalists tried to separate the epics into earlier layers and sources. Within that school, some believed the poems were built from many small independent songs, while others believed there had been a shorter original core later expanded. A smaller opposing group, often called Unitarians, argued that the epics showed artistic unity and should be treated as the work of one shaping poetic mind. The long debate over authorship, composition, and unity became widely known as the Homeric question. After the First World War, confidence in strict analyst methods declined. New research directions appeared. In the early 20th century, scholars Milman Parry and Albert Lord studied living oral poets in the Balkans. From their fieldwork, they developed the oral formulaic theory. They showed that long epic poems could be created through live performance using repeated phrases, stock descriptions, and traditional story patterns. This explained many features of the Iliad and the Odyssey, such as repeated epithets and recurring scenes. Their theory gained broad acceptance and reshaped modern Homeric studies. Later researchers, sometimes called neo-analysts, attempted a middle path. They compared the Homeric epics with other lost Greek epic traditions and looked for structural traces of earlier story versions. Rather than dismantling the poems, they studied how traditional myths and older narrative patterns may still be visible beneath the surviving text. Across these centuries, the pattern of study remained steady and cumulative. Printers, critics, linguists, and field researchers each added a layer of understanding. The poems stayed the same on the page, while the methods used to read them slowly evolved. The discussion continues in libraries and classrooms carried forward in a calm and methodical way. Most modern scholars, while differing on many details, broadly agree on several core points about the Homeric poems. They generally conclude that the Iliad and the Odyssey were not composed by the same author. This view rests on consistent differences between the two works, including variations in narrative style, religious outlook, ethical emphasis, vocabulary, and geographical awareness. Certain passages in the Odyssey also appear to imitate scenes from the Iliad, suggesting a later composition that looked back to the earlier poem. At the same time, scholars largely agree that each poem is internally unified. Neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey is understood today as a loose collection of unrelated songs. Each shows careful structure, sustained themes, and a clear overall design. The prevailing view is that each poem was shaped primarily by a single poet, working within a long-established oral tradition and drawing heavily on inherited material rather than inventing everything anew. One notable exception is Book 10 of the Iliad, often called the Doloneia, which most scholars consider a later edition, composed by a different poet. Ancient writers already disagreed about when Homer lived. Some believed he had witnessed the Trojan War himself, while others placed him centuries later. Modern scholars continue to debate the dating of the poems, made difficult by the long period of oral transmission that preceded their written form. Language, style, and historical references all provide clues, but none offer absolute certainty. Some researchers place the poems in the 8th century BC based on linguistic analysis and statistical study. Others suggest a slightly later period, pointing to the absence of certain military practices and social institutions that were common in later Greek history. Another line of argument compares the poems to the works of Hesiod and to events in the ancient Near East, proposing that the Iliad reflects knowledge of historical developments from the 7th century BC, with the Odyssey composed somewhat later. At the opposite end of the spectrum, a small group of scholars views Homer not as a fixed author at all, but as a tradition that continued to evolve over many generations. In this view, the poems gradually stabilized but remained flexible well into the Hellenistic period, shaped by performance, memory, and reinterpretation. Even the name Homer itself remains uncertain. Ancient writers proposed various explanations, including links to words meaning hostage or guarantor. Modern interpretations tend to reflect broader scholarly positions. Some see the name as referring to someone who fits the song together, while others suggest possible Greek or Near Eastern linguistic origins. What emerges from this long discussion is not a single conclusion, but a shared understanding of complexity. The poems are ancient, carefully shaped, deeply traditional, and resistant to simple explanation. Their origins remain partly obscured, resting between oral performance and written literature, where certainty fades and careful study continues. Scholars continue to examine the historical background behind the Homeric epics with careful and patient debate. Questions remain open about whether the Trojan War took place, when it might have occurred, and how closely the poems reflect real events. Researchers also consider whether the society described in the Iliad and the Odyssey represents the poet's own time, an earlier age remembered through tradition, or a blended imaginative world shaped from many periods. The settings of the epics lie mostly across the eastern and central Mediterranean. The poems mention coastal cities, islands, and sea routes, with occasional references to more distant regions such as Egypt and Ethiopia. The social world they present is organized around warrior elites, household authority, gift exchange, and honor in battle. In general tone, it resembles parts of early Greek society, though not any single moment with exact precision. In ancient Greek chronological tradition, the fall of Troy was placed in the late Bronze Age. For many centuries, this date was accepted without question. Later, especially in the 19th century, historians and critics grew doubtful that Troy had existed at all. That skepticism softened when the excavator, Heinrich Schliemann, announced that he had uncovered the remains of an ancient city at Hizarlik in modern Turkey. Archaeological work at the site revealed multiple settlement layers built over long stretches of time. One destruction level, often labeled Troy 7A, dates to the late Bronze Age and is considered by some scholars a possible historical seed behind later war legends. Others suggest that the epic story may combine memories of several different conflicts and sieges, gradually shaped into a single grand narrative through oral tradition. Most modern researchers agree that the material culture shown in the poems blends features from different eras. This mixed picture appears in many small details. The heroes often fight with bronze weapons, which belong to the Bronze Age setting of the story, yet funeral practices in the poems sometimes follow Iron Age customs. Shields are described in two different styles, some matching older Mycenaean types and others matching later, smaller forms known from the poet's own period. One passage describes a helmet made from boar's tusks, an item confirmed by archaeology for an earlier age, but already obsolete by the time the poems were likely composed. Further clarity about the Bronze Age Greek world increased after the decipherment of Linear B writing by Michael Ventris, which opened administrative records from Mycenaean palaces. These records revealed a structured palace society with close links to the wider Near Eastern world. That system differs in several ways from the social landscape portrayed in the epics, again suggesting that the poems preserve tradition rather than strict documentation. Some elements in the Homeric world appear to be poetic inventions. Descriptions of certain landmarks and natural features do not match archaeological findings. These details are often understood as part of the storyteller's craft, shaping dramatic scenes rather than recording geography. Taken together, the evidence suggests a layered picture. The epics rest on old memories, later practices, and creative additions, arranged into a coherent story world. The result is neither pure history nor pure fiction, but a composed landscape where tradition and imagination meet in a steady narrative form. The Homeric epics are written in a special poetic language that was not used in everyday conversation. Ancient scholars and modern linguists describe it as a literary art language, created and preserved specifically for epic verse. This poetic Greek draws from several regional dialects and older language layers, but its foundation is mainly Ionic Greek, the dialect associated with the Eastern Greek world. Careful linguistic study suggests that the Iliad was shaped slightly earlier than the Odyssey, and that many repeated poetic formulas inside the poems preserve very old language features. The verses are composed in dactylic hexameter, the standard meter of ancient Greek epic. This meter does not depend on rhyme or word stress, but on the length of syllables, moving in a steady pattern across each line. The rhythm is regular and measured, suited to long recitation. When read aloud at a calm pace, the lines follow a predictable flow, supporting memory and performance. A notable feature of Homeric style is the frequent use of fixed descriptive phrases known as epithets. These are repeated word groups attached to characters or natural forces, such as standard labels for heroes, gods, and times of day. Along with these come longer formula lines and half lines that fit neatly into the metrical pattern. Such phrases allowed a singer to maintain rhythm while composing lines in performance. The poems also use recurring similes, repeated scene patterns, and balanced phrasing. The sentence structure is usually straightforward and additive. Key ideas often appear early in the line, followed by additional clauses joined in sequence. This style, known as parataxis, favors coordination over deep subordination. Instead of long nested sentences, the poem advances step by step, detail by detail, which supports oral delivery and listener comprehension. Scholars have also identified recurring type scenes, a term introduced by researcher Walter Arend. These are standard scene patterns used for common actions, such as preparing a meal, arming for battle, making a sacrifice, or welcoming a guest. Each type scene follows a familiar order of elements, with small variations added for context. Earlier critics once saw these repetitions as signs of patchwork composition, but later oral poetry research showed that such patterned building blocks are normal and functional in traditional epic storytelling. Further work by Milman Parry and Albert Lord demonstrated that formula phrases and repeated scenes appear in many oral epic traditions around the world. In this light, repetition becomes not a flaw, but a working method, helping the poet compose fluently in performance. Another structural feature often noted is ring composition, sometimes called chiastic structure. In this pattern, themes or phrases appear in one order and later return in reverse order, creating a verbal circle. A sequence may move A, B, C, and later echo back C, B, A. Some scholars see this as a deliberate artistic device, others as a natural outcome of oral narrative memory, and some as a mixture of both. Both epics open in the same traditional way, with a calm, formal request to divine inspiration. The poet calls upon a muse to sing the story. The Iliad asks for the song of Achilles' anger, while the Odyssey asks for the story of the wandering man. This quiet invocation sets the tone for the long narrative that follows, and later, epic poets adopted the same gentle opening gesture when beginning their own works. For many generations, the Homeric poems were carried by voice rather than by page. Singers learned them through listening and repetition, performing them aloud in halls, festivals, and gatherings. At some point, between the early and middle centuries of the first millennium BC, these long oral works were set down in writing. The exact moment is not known, but most scholars place it within a broad window, between the 8th and 6th centuries BC. Some researchers suggest that the poems were dictated to a scribe by a master poet or performer. In this view, the written Iliad and Odyssey began as spoken texts captured line by line. Studies of living oral traditions support this possibility. The scholar Albert Lord observed that Balkan epic singers often expanded and reshaped their songs while dictating them, adding detail and structure in the very act of recording. By comparison, the Homeric poems may also have grown and shifted slightly at the moment they entered written form. Other scholars propose a slower path. According to this view, the poems continued to circulate orally for generations after their earliest composition, with performers revising and adapting them before they were finally written down in more fixed versions. In such a process, variation would have been natural, with no single, official text at first. Once written copies began to circulate, the poems were eventually organized into 24 sections each, now called books. These divisions follow the letters of the Greek alphabet and provide a convenient structure for reference and teaching. Most scholars attribute this system to later editors working in the scholarly centers of the Hellenistic world, especially in Alexandria. A few argue that some form of division may go back earlier, but almost none believe the poet himself created the book structure. Ancient tradition held that an Athenian ruler arranged for the poems to be collected and organized into an official version. Later writers referred to this as a major editorial effort in Athens, remembered in Roman sources and ancient biographies. Whether this event occurred exactly as described remains uncertain, but the story shows how strongly people believed the poems needed careful preservation. As written copies spread, variation between manuscripts gradually narrowed. By the later Hellenistic period, the text appears to have become more stable. Scholars working at the Great Library and Research Center in Alexandria compared manuscripts, marked doubtful lines, and selected preferred readings. Editors such as Zenodotus of Ephesus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus of Samothrace played important roles in shaping the standard form of the text through careful comparison and annotation. The first printed edition of the Homeric poems appeared in Renaissance Italy through the work of Demetrios Chalkokondyles, bringing the epics into the age of print. Since then, editors have continued to compare medieval manuscripts, papyrus fragments, and ancient quotations. Some modern scholars aim to reconstruct a single best text, while others prefer a multi-text approach that accepts several ancient variants side by side. Through all these stages, the movement has been gradual and deliberate. From voice to writing, from scroll to print, from manuscript room to modern edition, the poems have been preserved by long chains of careful copying and quiet study. Homer stands at the quiet beginning of recorded Western literature, not as a clearly known individual, but as a powerful and enduring presence behind two vast poems that have traveled across centuries. His name is attached to stories of war, wandering, homecoming, loss, endurance, and fate. Yet the closer scholars look, the more they find complexity instead of certainty. The person remains distant, but the poetry remains precise. The Iliad and the Odyssey survived not because of a single manuscript or a single authorial signature, but because generations chose to remember them. They were spoken before they were written, repeated before they were analyzed, and taught before they were fully explained. Singers carried the verses across regions. Teachers repeated them in classrooms. Editors preserved them in libraries. Printers set them into type. Translators carried them into new languages. Each age received the poems in a different way, but the steady thread never fully broke. Across time, Homer became many things to many readers. To ancient students, he was a foundation of education. To philosophers, he was a hidden teacher of wisdom. To critics, he was a puzzle of authorship and composition. To historians, he was a window into an imagined heroic age. To poets, he was a model of scale and structure. To storytellers, he was proof that long narrative can endure when built on rhythm, memory, and human truth. The debates will likely continue. Questions about authorship, date, sources, and historical background remain open and active. New discoveries in archaeology, linguistics, and comparative oral tradition continue to refine the picture. But the lasting importance of the poems does not depend on solving every uncertainty. Their influence rests in their narrative force, their memorable characters, and their steady poetic motion. In the Iliad, we see the cost of anger and the weight of honor. In the Odyssey, we follow patience, endurance, and the long road home. These themes remain understandable across cultures and centuries. That is why the poems continue to be read slowly, translated repeatedly, and studied with care. If you have listened this far, you have walked through one of the oldest surviving literary landscapes in the world. Thank you. for spending this time in calm historical reflection. If you enjoyed this deep, steady journey into ancient literature, consider subscribing for more long-form biographies and historical explorations designed for relaxed listening. Leave a comment with the next figure or text you would like covered. Until next time, rest well, take care, and let the story settle quietly in your thoughts.